In Diablo 4, the smallest item aspect or skill choice that you make can have a huge impact in your overall build. And I found a couple examples that I think really go to show this to an exceptional degree. So I wanted to introduce you all to the skill Bone Storm. Bone Storm on paper is pretty innocuous. It has a 1-minute cooldown, it's a bone skill, it's one of your ultimates. It summons this big swirling bone storm around the Necromancer on cast, dealing a decent amount of weapon damage over 10 seconds in the form of physical damage that benefits from things that say plus to bone skill damage. One of its modifiers says that it gains an additional 15% damage reduction while it's active, and you gain 20% critical strike chance when it's active. So this is one of the best skills for buffing out your total damage output on a pure bone necromancer, and that's what we're using it on right now, a bone spear necromancer that absolutely loves all of these stats. Now, ironically enough, on a build that spends a ton of essence, generating a lot of essence can typically be a problem, so I'm actually using Corpse Explosion as a mana battery. So let me go ahead and show you that really quickly. So here we have a ton of monsters. I'm going to cast all my bone spears, just kind of empty out the mana pool. And if I were to use my generator, which is bone splinters, you'll see that we get a decent amount of essence every time that we use it, but it's definitely nothing that's too impressive. Now, instead of doing that, let me recast my bone spear, get rid of all my essence, and instead use Corpse Explosion on these readily available demon corpses. Each cast is getting us a massive amount of essence on use, and we're very quickly able to fill our essence orb and keep the bone spear engine churning. Now, what does this have to do with Bone Storm? Well, the reason why that works at all is because we're using Grim Harvest. Grim Harvest says consuming a corpse generates 9 essence. And then on top of that, whenever we consume a corpse, we're actually going to gain 9% multiplicative damage for 6 seconds. So when we're looking at Bone Storm, is there any way for us to make it part of this engine? Luckily enough, there is. There's actually a resource aspect for the Necromancer that says that Bone Storm consumes 8 corpses to increase its duration by an amount that rolls between 4 to 8 seconds. So if Bone Storm only lasts for 10 seconds and you have a best roll on this one, eating up a bunch of corpses around you makes it last for 18 seconds, or almost double the amount of time. So you have double the amount of time for your damage reduction and double the amount of time for that increase to critical strike chance. So obviously that seems pretty good. You might not really consider it to be good enough to take up an entire ring slot because you could have additional damage or better resource generation, but let's read the verbiage on it very closely one more time. Bone Storm consumes 8 corpses. Because of this, it triggers everything that says when you consume a corpse. So again, let's just go ahead and spend all of our essence here. Oh, we actually got a legendary drop. I'm out of essence. I'm going to use Bone Storm, and you'll notice that as we run over corpses, it's consuming them and generating essence just like you normally would, and we're also getting our damage bonus from that same corpse consumption mechanic. You also notice that it's obviously lasting as long as it should, since we ate the full total of 8 corpses. And right here is where I really want to drill down on just how monumental of a change simple aspects can be in completely redesigning your build. So if Bone Storm is now a skill that says consuming corpses, what else can it interact with? Well, we also have consuming a corpse is going to increase the next use of our core skill. So if the entire point of Bone Storm is to buff up our crit chance for our Bone Spear, and Bone Spear uses a ton of essence, well, every time that we generate a corpse when we use a skill, which is another part of our skill board right here, your damage has up to 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. Now our Bone Storm has a chance of hitting lucky hit to generate corpses and then consuming them. Consuming them gets us our essence, gets us our flat bonus damage here, and then also increases our core skill damage from this aspect. So now it's just an even more efficient engine for churning out massive damage, but it goes even further than that. Right now we're building into the Flesh Eater board on our Paragon system, and this says when you consume 5 corpses, grant 40% multiplicative damage for 6 seconds. And this stacks on top of all your other multiplicative damage, and it's not looking at particular bone skills or core skills or anything like that. It just says if we consume 5 corpses, once that happens, deal this much additional damage for 6 seconds. So now I've walked up to the boss, I've cast Bone Storm to get my damage reduction and my critical strike chance. I'm casting a ton of missiles with Bone Spear using up essence. The Bone Spears are hitting lucky hit, they're generating corpses. The Bone Storm's eating the corpses, getting me increased damage from core skills, getting me increased damage across the board with this legendary node, and generating me the essence that I need to keep casting Bone Spears. So now our engine's even more efficient, but it goes even deeper than that. This particular legendary aspect has an even more interesting mechanical shift to it, which is that Bone Storm and Blood Wave, two different ultimates for the Necromancer, are now considered darkness skills, and they gain an additional component to them. Enemies damaged by Bone Storm are now going to take a small amount of shadow damage over 2 seconds. And whenever damage over time is applied to a target, it ticks twice per second. So this is going to be 4 activations of shadow damage on a target. But how could this possibly help us out when we're a bone build? When you actually put on the ring and hover back over to Bone Storm, you'll see that it's now labeled as a darkness skill. And while it doesn't talk about the additional shadow damage that it deals, that damage can build into other systems that previously it couldn't. Oddly enough, Bone Spear isn't the only skill that benefits from a ton of crit from the core skills that the Necromancer has. Another great option for that is actually Sever. Sever has 4 damage components, it deals darkness or shadow damage, so it can interact with a lot of different passives and aspects. It also can apply vulnerable and gains additional damage from our summons, but that's not really why we're interested in it. The Shadow Blight passive says that every 10 instances of dealing shadow damage to targets at all will tick up and cause a 20% weapon damage application in additional damage. And that doesn't sound altogether that interesting, right? Okay, so now you could use Bone Storm, which is applying darkness damage, which is ticking 4 times, to help your shadow build be able to do more damage more quickly, getting more procs from this. But it goes even deeper than that. This aspect Blighted says that on the 10th activation of our Shadow Blight key passive, we deal an additional 50% X multiplier for 6 seconds. And that might not seem altogether that impressive, but this is a Codex of Power roll on it. This is the minimum roll that you can possibly get on this. Let's go ahead and look at what it might look like if we were to put it onto a 2-handed weapon. If you look at the range here on a 2-handed weapon, which actually doubles the effectiveness of any aspect that you put on it, the top end of it is 240% increased multiplicative damage for 6 seconds after your Shadow Blight passive has procced 10 times. You might ask, like, how often does that happen? On a pure darkness build that has a massive ton of dots all applying simultaneously, you basically have this up every 6 seconds. So it's up for 6 seconds, and it takes 6 seconds to generate it, depending on how many monsters there is. So it's basically up half of the time. Now, a Sever build that was already going to be using the Shadow Blight passive can benefit from having the skill Bone Storm, which you otherwise would never typically run because there's not really a good enough reason to slot it into the build, considering just getting the crit chance in DR isn't worth throwing away one of the other skills on your toolbar. But what if your Bone Storm, now counted as a darkness skill that procced a ton of lucky hit, gave you DR, consumed more corpses to increase the length of time that you benefit from the crit chance, which is something that's typically only reserved for your bone skills. It's getting you a ton of damage reduction, and it's generating you a ton of essence, helping to increase your Shadow Blight proc rate, meaning that you have a greater uptime of that 240% multiplicative damage, which is another number that you typically don't see outside of the bone skills on the Necromancer. Would you believe me if I said it goes even further than that? One of the biggest issues that the Necromancer faces is that it has nearly no mobility skills at all. In fact, the only benefits directly in its skill tree to movement speed are on darkness skills, and that's with Reaper's Pursuit, which says anytime that you deal shadow damage from a darkness skill, you are going to gain up to 15% additional movement speed for 3 seconds. So that means if you're not a darkness build, you have no options for mobility at all. Except now, your Bone Storm is also a darkness skill that deals shadow damage, and you can now slot in 3 points for Reaper's Pursuit if you're really hungry for mobility on your pure bone build, or your pure blood build if instead you use the same exact aspect but you picked up the Blood Wave, which also counts as a darkness skill that deals shadow damage with that aspect activated. Not only that, you could even choose to opt in to the lucky hit chance of applying stun with your Bone Storm. Oddly enough, the bone skills don't have a lot of options for applying crowd control, so it's actually very difficult to stagger bosses with these skills. You output a ton of damage, and that's really your calling card, but you can't really attribute to stagger on world bosses. You won't be able to stagger harder nightmare dungeon bosses. You'll basically just have to fight them outright. But all of a sudden, that Bone Storm, which is getting you your crit chance, it's extending your length, it's getting you additional core skill damage, it's also generating resource for you, and it's giving you a massive amount of damage reduction, is now also getting you movement speed so that you can survive and evade in combat more effectively, and it's applying stagger and stun to monsters around you that happen to not be the boss, and the stagger is adding up on the boss itself. And these are all the things that I just kind of thought up when I first saw this ring, tossed it on and went, oh, this is going to be a great engine for generating resource. And then I stopped for a second and went, what else could this do? A major reason why I wanted to make this video, and I know that a lot of people at this point have come around to it, but I still see some holdouts that are generally saying the itemization in Diablo 4 isn't deep enough, the skill tree isn't deep enough, it's not really complex in any way, it pales in comparison to PoE, it's not even as good as old D2 or D3. I just wanted to point out this single aspect that says that Bone Storm's length is increased if it consumes corpses, has a multitude of cascading, build changing and defining total alterations that you can make to gather a ton of utility, additional damage, move a skill into a skill build that normally wouldn't fit into, and just overall changing how you look at your build and considering what tools could be available to it if you happen to toss this thing on. So I hope that that little rabbit hole deep dive into just how complex the aspects, Paragon board, and skill tree can become when you put them all together, and I hope to get you that much more excited for diving into the endgame of Diablo 4 with the release. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.